The next group of screens is the recipe screens. Again, they're broken up into several subscreens, in this case 6 subscreens. So the very first screen is the library screen. That kind of defines how the recipes are stored as well as what's active. So the recipe library are recipes that are stored on the SD card in the back of the HMI screen. So in the case of our example here, if I look at the drop-down list, I've created 2 recipes, Demo 01 and Demo 02. The icons below this drop-down list all relate to saving and creating new files relative to the recipe library. So again, this is all the recipes stored in the HMI screen and has nothing to do with active parameters on the machine. So we have the option to create a new recipe. We could save a recipe, do a save as, delete it, or even rename or renumber the recipe number. Besides the actual recipe library, to move recipes to and from the machine, there is load and save. So the concept of a load is whatever you have set up in the recipe library will be moved down into an active recipe. An active recipe are the parameters that define how the machine shall behave. So for example, if we had in the first portion of your fill inject at 1000 psi, if you're modifying that parameter, you're modifying the active recipe. You are not modifying the recipe library. That is separate. You have to fire a save to move those parameters back from the machine, whatever you modified, into that saved file on the SD card of the HMI. So in the case of loading a recipe, we'd select what we want. In this case, I might want recipe Demo 2. If I do a load, what will happen is it will move Demo 2 to Demo 1. And then you get confirmation to verify that that is what you want to do. Once I hit OK, it will verify, yep, that Demo 2 is now loaded into an active recipe. Vice versa, if I save it, you'll get confirmation, are you sure you want to move the active recipe of Demo 2 into the saved recipe in the library of Demo 2? If I hit OK, it will save it. If you click on View Library, it will actually let you see the parameters saved away in the recipe library. These are not active parameters. These are what were saved away on the SD card. If you modify these parameters, you're modifying the SD card. You're not modifying the machine. All right, click Return to go back. Now the actual settings themselves for the machine, we have heater settings, so what three zones of heat and what temperature we want them set at. We also have the inject parameters. This is what we've seen before in the auto screening manual, where we have our fill distance, or our distance for first and second phases of the fill, as well as the pressure for first and second. If you don't want to use the second fill parameter, you just zero it out. In this case, we've zeroed out the pressure, so the system automatically skips over the second phase. If there's zero pressure or zero distance, it's not a valid fill parameter, so it skips right over it. So in this guy's case, we're really only using the first half. All right, so and then besides the fill, we also have the pack setting. So how big is our cushion we want, as well as what pressure do we usually want to pack at. We also have the option to turn packing on and off. The next screen over is our packing screen, where again we have the option to turn pack on and off. This button is no different than we had on the previous screen. If I turn it off here, it turns off on this screen. But we also have our cutoff parameters, so these are the triggers again that decides when do we switch from fill to pack. The 1/4 of an inch is so when the barrel or the injector is a 1/4 of an inch from the bottom of the barrel, you should switch to pack. Or if you've been filling for more than 10 seconds, you should switch to pack. Or if the pressure ever exceeds this value during a fill, switch to pack. And then when we enter pack, you pack for, in this example, 5 seconds and at 400 psi. Recovery is again for pulling material from the hopper into the barrel. So you have 2 options. You either have recovery at the beginning of the cycle or the end of the cycle. Now the benefits between these two vary. So usually if you're setting up a mold for the first time, it's better to have the recovery at the beginning of the cycle, because you might be adjusting your inject or your packing settings and realize you might have to add or take away material. Because recovery is the beginning of your cycle, you can make your parameter changes, start the cycle, the machine will fill to that new shot size, and then run through it. The drawback of putting it at the beginning is you're actually going to lose cycle time, because now you have to wait for the machine to fill up, versus if you put it at the end of the cycle, so after you've actually shot material in the mold and you've waited for the mold set to finish. What happens is the carriage can pull up off the mold, the operator can pull out the part, get it, clean out the mold, put the mold back in place while the machine is recovering for the next shot. So end of cycle is great for once you have everything dialed in, you get faster production runs. Start of cycle is great for when you're initially trying to dial everything in and you're not 100% sure what your shot sizes are. So the recovery parameters, for one of them, the first one is your mold set time. That's how long do we hold pressure on the mold with the carriage or the nozzle tip after we've shot material into the mold. Then we also have decompress or suck back distance. So there is an option on the machine that after you've done recovery, all that material is under pressure. But you might want to relieve a little bit of pressure so you can actually have the injector back up, in this example, 1/4 of an inch, and that gives a little bit more space for the material in the barrel to expand, in other words, decompress within the barrel. Suck back pressure is just the pressure we need. If we want to run the injectors up, that's what pressure we use to run the injection cylinders up. The extrude pressure is the pressure we use to spin the hydraulic motor for the screw. The last parameters in this case is the carriage parameters. So there's actually two closed parameters, one for auto mode, one for manual. So typically in the closed pressure, what this means is, so when we drive the nozzle down onto the mold, how hard do we drive it? 500 psi in this case. In fact, we have it for both. But some people might want 1000 psi to really help close the mold and prevent from any material from squeezing out through the edges of the mold. What we've had some people ask in the past is the purge plate is not as strong or rigid as a mold. And so if you come down with 1000 psi or 1500 psi, you are going to warp that purge plate. So in manual mode, we give you the option to say, look, when you come down on the purge plate, you can come down at 500 psi and not risk bending that plate. Open pressure is just how much pressure we need to lift the carriage off the mold. That won't vary between auto and manual mode. It should always pretty much be the same. It's just pretty much how much pressure we need to actually lift the mechanics up off the mold. And then the carriage hold time is when the carriage comes down and makes contact with the mold for the first time, how much time do we want to verify we've truly hit the down on the mold? What we are doing at this point is we're watching for a pressure spike on the system. You told it to come down at 500 psi in this case, so we want to make sure the system actually gets up to 500 psi before we consider it closed. And we in fact give a 1 second delay in this example to say, look, you have to be at 500 psi for 1 second for me to consider the mold is closed. Thus, if you increase this carriage hold time to like 2 seconds, now you have to be at 500 psi for 2 seconds before we will consider the mold is closed. There are additional parameters that you might see on a 70 or 75 machine. For example, settings related to the clamping or the shuttle or the screw or eject. Most of that's pretty much, again, just very similar to the carriage parameters of what's your close and open pressure and if there's any hold times associated to those.